on DAF Kuf Amud Aleph, and we're learning about the prohibition of using things that are growing from the ground. As long as they're higher than 3 tvachim, you're not allowed to sit on them. And the fear, of course, as Rabbi has had, that you would, by allowing you to lean or sit on these items that are growing from the ground like a tree, you're going to come to break off possibly a branch or a leaf or something like that, and you'll be over in the malach of tolesh. And so that's the blanket prohibition. The Mishnah had said that if you have a root system that protrudes up from the ground higher than 3 tvachim, you're not allowed to sit on it either. And that's what we're going to be analyzing today. So Itmar, Sharshe Ilan Haboin Milamalo Mishlosha L'Sok Shlosha. What if you have a root system where the root protrudes upwards and then it curves downwards, so that by the time you get to the end of this large bent root, you're below 3 tvachim and you want to sit on it? Is that okay? So Rabba Amar Mutter Lishtamish Bahen, Rav Sheshis Amar Asr Lishtamish Bahen. It's Machlokas Rabba and Rav Sheshis. One says Mutter and one says Asr. So Rabba Amar Mutter Lishtamish Bahen, Dechol Pachos Migimel Da'ara Arahi. Rabba says it's Mutter because it's lower than 3 tvachim Lamaisa, where you want to use it, and it's perfectly fine. And it's lavud, so it's like sitting on the ground. There's no problem. Rav Sheshis Amar Asr Lishtamish Bahen Dekevin Demikoach Isser Ka'asi Asurin. And Rav Sheshis says no. He says because since it comes from a larger system of root that has come from a higher place, higher than 3 tvachim, it's coming from a koach of Isser. It originates in a place of higher than 3 tvachim, and therefore it's going to be Asr. Dedamu Kimashunisa. And it's like a Mashunisa. Rashi explains that a Mashunisa is tributary rocks that come out of a larger mountain. And by analogy, it's like a root system which has tributary roots. So you've got a large root, and you've got side roots coming out of it. And Rav Sheshis' opinion is that because the larger root is higher than 3 tvachim, then all the tributary roots are also going to be usher, regardless of whether they're higher or not. And therefore Rav Sheshis says that just like a tributary root is ancillary to the parent root, so too the extension of the root, which is lower than 3 tvachim, is ancillary to the origin of the root, which was higher than 3 tvachim. Now, Desalkin la'ela asurin. Now, the Gemara just clarifies that when Rav Sheshis prohibits these tributary roots, he says if the tributary root is also above 3 tvachim, just like the parent root is, so then both Rabba and Rav Sheshis agree that it's asur to lean on it or sit on it. Denachnin l'taso isharu. If the tributary root is growing out of a place where it's completely below 3 tvachim, then even Rav Sheshis will agree that even though the parent root is higher than 3 tvachim, it's no different from a tree that has branches. As long as the lowest branch is lower than 3 tvachim, you're allowed to sit on that branch. However, litzdadin plugta. But the machlokis is when the tributary root is growing out of a parent root, and the tributary root originates a little bit higher than 3 tvachim and then dips below the 3 tvachim mark. The Rabbi of Rav Sheshis, that's the machlokes. V'cheina nigra, and similarly, there's going to be a machlokes in a case of where a tree is growing from a ditch or a groove in the ground. The same machlokes that Rabbi and Rav Sheshis have by a root which is lower presently than 3 tvachim, but originates in a place higher than 3 tvachim. The same machlokes will exist when you have a tree where it's growing from a ditch in the ground. So let's say you have like a groove in the ground, an indentation in the ground. The tree grows from there so that when you're looking at ground level, you only have a small stub coming out of the ground, less than 3 tvachim from ground level. But yet if you go in the ditch, you can see that you have a whole tree that's much taller. Rav Sheshis' position is since you look at the totality of the system, and you see that it's actually a bigger than 3 tvachim growing from where its origin is, so then you look at it as higher than 3 tvachim, and it's aser. Rabbi says, look at the end product, and if it's above ground level, and that's what you're looking at, so you can isolate that one piece that's above ground level, and if it's lower than 3 tvachim from the ground, then it's mutter. V'chein bekeren zavis, and the same thing will be true if you have a tree that's growing into a wall. Now, what's the case? A lot of times you have like a tree that grows mamish like adjacent or built into, they build the wall around the tree, right? So in a situation where the tree is bounded on 3 sides by a wall, so that it's really mamish part of the wall, and there's only a small part of the tree that's visible because it's bounded on all sides because it's in a corner, so then you'll have the same machlokas. Rav Sheshis will say, since Lamaisa you could still see that there's a portion, at least from a partial view, that the tree originates from the ground going up, it's much higher than 3 tvachim, then it's going to be aser. Rabbi says, no, you look at the top of the wall. Lamaisa, the tree is mostly surrounded by wall, and so therefore, just look at the top. If the top of the wall is lower, the tree protrudes above the wall less than 3 tvachim, so then it's going to be okay. It's the same principle. Hahu dikla dahavale abaye v'havasolik bi'ipuma. So the Gemara says there was once a story about a tree that was on Abaye's property, and it was growing inside a house. And many times that could happen. You have a tree growing in a house, you let it grow out through the skylight, and the top of the tree was coming out of the house less than 3 tvachim. The question was, can I utilize the tree on Shabbos? So Asa Lakami de Rav Yosef Isharale. So they came before Rav Yosef, and he said it's perfectly fine. Amar Rav Acha bar Tachlifa de Sharalach ki Rabba Sharalach. So Rav Acha said, whoever gave you that heter must paskin like Rabba, who says that you just look at the top of the tree that's coming out of the house, and if it's less than 3 tvachim, it's fine. So the Gemara says, Pshita. Why did he have to overstate the obvious? Of course he's going like Rabba. So the Gemara says, no. Ma'udu tema filu l'Rav Sheishis basic command demoli dami v'lishtamish b'pachos migimel samach l'gag kamash malan. Then no, you might have thought that even Rav Sheishis would agree that it's permissible in this situation, for the simple reason that in many cases in halacha, in Hilchas Shabbos, we say that a house, since it's bounded on all sides with a roof, is considered to be filled with solid mass. And therefore, even Rav Sheshis could conceivably hold that the only part of the tree that's truly exposed is the part that's protruding above the roof. So comes along Rav Acha bar Tachlif, and he says, no, Rav Sheshis would also be stringent over here as well. Okay, Tanan, Shirashav Gavomin Haaretz Gimel Tvachim Lo Yeshiv Aleim. So our Mishnah, now we have to go back to our Mishnah and see about this machlokus between Rabbi and Rav Sheshis. Our Mishnah says that if the root system is above 3 tvachim, you're not allowed to sit on it. So heichidami. So what was our Mishnah addressing? Idelo hadri kaifi pshita. If the roots that are going above 3 tvachim do not dip afterwards at the end of below 3 tvachim, so then why is the Mishnah stating the obvious? This is just a corollary of the standard halacha that you're not allowed to be mishtamish be'ilan. You're not allowed to use anything that's growing from the ground on Shabbos. So why does the Mishnah have to give me this specific example? Elalav aflagav da hadri kaifi. So it must be that the Mishnah is addressing a case where the root starts above 3 tvachim, then it dips below 3 tvachim, and it's telling me that it's still usher. This is a raya to Rav Sheshis, and it's a kasha on Rabba from our Mishnah. So the Gemara says, lo. La'olam delo hadri kaifi. V'hakamashmalan aflagav detzido echad shavila aretz. Answers the Gemara, no. We're not talking about a case where the root's above, and then it dips below. We're talking about a case of a tree which is situated on a split-level piece of land. So from one side you look at it, and the root is not protruding above 3 tvachim. But from the other side you look at it, and the root is well above 3 tvachim. So in that scenario, that's where the Mishnah is telling you that it's aser. The only time that Rabbah was willing to be permissive, we got to go in. The only time that Rabbah was willing to be permissive was if the tree's growing into a corner wall where it's bounded on most of the sides. But here there's only 2 sides here. One side it looks less than 3 tvachim, one side looks more than 3 tvachim. So that's where everyone agrees that it's going to be aser. So it's not really a kasha on Rabbah anymore. Let's go weiter. Tana Rabbanan, Shar she'ilan shegavon min haaretz gimel tvachim. If you have the roots of a tree that grow above 3 tvachim off the ground, o sheyesh chalal tachteim gimel tvachim, or let's say the tree is in a recess, such that that it's in a hole that's deeper than 3 tvachim. Afal pi shetzido echad shavil haaretz harei lo yeshiv alein. Even if it's on a split level, so that only on one side are the roots going up above 3 tvachim, but on the other side, like we said, that the roots look like they're coming from they're not growing above the ground. You're nevertheless not allowed to use those roots on Shabbos. Lefi shein olin be'ilan, and the reason is, says the Brisa, this is the standard halacha. You're not allowed to climb a tree. Ve'in itlin be'ilan, you're not allowed to swing from a tree. Ve'in ishanin be'ilan, you're not allowed to lean on a tree. V'lo yala be'ilan mi ba'od yam v'yeshev sham kol hayom kulo. Nor are you allowed to even climb up a tree before Shabbos, even if your intention is to stay there the whole day. Because basically the Chachamim's attitude is, every second that you're on the tree, you're committing a violation of the rabbinic prohibition. So don't think, well, I got here before Shabbos, I'm okay. No, you're not okay, it's aser. Echad ilan ve'echad kol behema. And this is true for trees, and it's true for animals as well. Just like it's the same prohibition. You're not allowed to ride an animal, even if you were on the animal from before Shabbos. But that's only true with living creatures and things that are growing from the ground. But if you have non-organic things, so you have a ditch, a cave, a big fence, or a wall, those you're allowed to descend into and climb up, even if there's 100 amas that you have to scale. And therefore, what the Bryce is telling me is that the reason for the prohibition has got nothing to do with physical exertion. Physical exertion we can live with. What we can't live with is climbing a tree, which may potentially cause you to do a malacha of tolesh, of breaking off a branch. Tanu chada im ola muter leired, v'tani chada asur leired. So now we have a contradiction in Bryces. One Bryce says that if you climb a tree, then you're not allowed to go down. The other Brisa says that if you climbed it, you are allowed to go down. So lo kasher, kan mi ba'ojam, kan mi shachashecha. So one way of reconciling it is to say that one Brisa is talking about where you climb the tree before Shabbos. So even though you're up there right now, we still allow you to descend from the tree. We're not going to penalize you because you didn't climb it in a prohibited fashion. But when you climbed up in a prohibited fashion, we're going to penalize you until you can't even descend from the tree. Alternatively, both cases are where you climb the tree from before after Shabbos started. But the reconciliation is if you did it b'shogeg, you didn't realize it was usher to climb the tree, so then we let you come down. But if you deliberately climb the tree in flagrant violation of the rabbinic law, your kanas is, your penalty is we don't let you come down.
But in either case, you want to get the guy out because like you said, every moment he's up there, he's
right. But there's an even greater imperative of not letting you come down because while you're climbing down, you could also break a branch.
That's more likely.
Well, I don't know if it's more likely, but it's at least equal to the prohibition of staying stationary on top of a tree.
But you could argue that once he's down, he's at least now not doing.
Okay, all right. At least, well, if you're sitting on the tree, you're in violation of a rabbinic law, but there's no fear that you're going to do a malacha. By descending the tree, even though chronologically it's a much shorter span of time, but there's a greater likelihood that you're going to break something. Another answer could be is that there actually is a machlokes between these two brises. That we're talking about a guy who accidentally climbed the tree or unintentionally climbed the tree, and the machlokes is: do we penalize a person who's a shogeg and subsuming him under the general penalty that we place upon a mezid? Do we do him because of the general rule that we penalize anyone who does something flagrantly, or do we not? Mar savar kansinan or mar savar lo kansinan. This is the machlokes. So Amar Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yehoshua Kitanai. Rav Huna Berei de Rav Yehoshua says if you're going to say that this is the machlokes, then we can also say that this same machlokes about once you climbed it up, do we let you come down, is also based on the machlokes tanoim. And what's the machlokes tanoim? Hanitonin b'matana echas shenisarvu b'nitonin b'matana echas yinostim b'matana echas. So the first of all, we have to understand we're talking about zvachim here. We're talking about korbanos. There are certain kinds of korbanos, like a korban bechor, that you have to place the blood on the side of the altar, but you only have to splash it on one spot on the mizbeach. There are other types of korbanos, like a korban chatas, where in order to properly place the blood on the mizbeach, it has to be placed on all four sides of the mizbeach. Okay? Now, if you have two different korbanos, but the method of placement of blood is the same for both of their korbanos. Let's say you have two korbanos bechor, and the bloods accidentally get mixed together in one container. So there you have no problem, because what you basically do is you do one placement of blood, which counts for both of those korbanos. Matan dalad b'matan dalad, yinostim b'matan dalad. Similarly, if you have two korbanos chatas that the bloods get mixed together, you do the placement on all four sides of the mizbeach, and that covers you for both. But matan arba b'matan echas. But now we have a problem. What happens if you have a situation where you have a korban chatas blood, the blood of a korban chatas gets mixed with the blood of a korban bechor? So if you only do one placement, you're shortchanging the korban chatas. If you do a placement of four, then you're overdoing it with the korban bechor, and you're not allowed to overplace blood either, just like you're not allowed to underplace blood. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer Yinasnu b'matan daled, v'Rabbi Yeshua Omer Yinasnu b'batana echas. So here's the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. Rabbi Eliezer says, go ahead and do 4 placements of blood, and Rabbi Yehoshua says, only do 1 placement. So Amarlo Rabbi Eliezer harehu over al bal tigra. Rabbi Eliezer challenges Rabbi Yehoshua. You, Rabbi Yehoshua, say that you should only do 1 placement. What about the prohibition of not diminishing the requisite amount of placements? There's a prohibition of the Torah. You shall not diminish the prescribed method of the Torah. If the Torah says do 4, you're not allowed to do 1. You have to do all 4. So aren't you violating bal tigra? So Amarlo Rabbi Yehoshua harehu over bal toisif. So Rabbi Yehoshua says, well, by the very same token, if you've got 2 bloods mixed together and one only requires 1, then by doing 4, then that the blood of that korban is being overdone, and there's an isser of bal tosif, there's an isser of adding on to a mitzvah. So there's an equal avera of detracting as there is to adding. So Amar Rabbi Eliezer lo amru ela kishehu ba'atzma. So Rabbi Eliezer's response to that challenge, he says the isser of bal tosif is only when you have the isolated blood by itself. And you go ahead and you do 4 placements instead of 1. But here, because it's mixed with another blood, then the isser of bal tosif doesn't even apply, because it's not your intention to add more for that particular korban. So Amar lo Rabbi Yehoshua lo nemar bal tigra ela kishehu ba'atzmo. So it's basically saying what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? If you're telling me that there's no isser of bal tosif when the bloods are mixed together, well, then there's no isser of bal tigra, of subtracting from the requisite placement when the bloods are mixed together. Va'od Amar Rabbi Yehoshua, and Rabbi Yehoshua further argues and says, I'll tell you why I think my method is more advantageous to only do 1 placement. Because Kishanasata avarta al bal tosif yosisa ma'isa biyodecha. Kishalonasata avarta bal tigra v'lo asisa ma'isa biyodecha. Rabbi Yeshua's argument is very simply this. It's a no-win situation. You got to choose the lesser of the 2 evils. When you do 4 placements, you're covering both karbanos, but you're also being over on bal tosif, but you're doing it proactively. When you're by doing a physical act that you shouldn't be doing. When you only do 1 placement, it's true you're over on bal tigra, but you're doing it passively. It's much better to do an isser passively than it is to do an isser actively. So therefore, if you have to choose between the lesser of 2 evils, it's much better to do my method of doing 1 placement instead of doing 4 placements. Lorette, so therefore, the Gemara is basically now that we've seen the end of the Brisa, let's now take a look and see how we can line this up with the issue of a guy who's up in a tree, whether he should come down or not. Rabbi Eliezer Damar Hasam Kumasei Adev Hachanami Yered. Rabbi Eliezer's attitude is, do whatever you can to remedy the situation. So therefore, his attitude would also be, when you're up in a tree, better that you should come down. Act proactively to alleviate as much as you can. So therefore, just like Rabbi Eliezer says, throw as much blood as you can on that mizbeach, so too, do whatever you can to get off the tree. And the Rabbi Yehoshua, the Amar Hasam Sheval Taisa Adif Hachanami de Lo Yered. Hachanami Lo Yered. According to Rabbi Yehoshua, who says that no, it's better to be passive if you have to choose between the lesser of 2 evils. So too over here, it's better to be passive and not descend from the tree, because at least you're passively violating the rabbinic prohibition and not actively. So the Gemara says no, Dilma Lohi. Maybe it's not an analogy at all, because Adkan lo kamar Rabbi Eliezer hasam kumasei adif eladika avid mitzvah, aval hachad lo avid mitzvah chanami lo yered. Maybe the only time that Rabbi Eliezer says that we advocate actively doing something that's not okay is only when in the course of doing that thing that's not okay, you're also doing a mitzvah. But over here, by descending the tree, you're not doing a mitzvah; you're just alleviating an aveira. So maybe that's not as compelling of an argument to allow you to descend the tree, because there's no mitzvah accomplished in the course of doing that. The inami adkan lo kamer Rabbi Yehoshua hasam sheval taisa adif is bidelo kavid isura aval hacha de kavid isura chanami diyere. Alternatively, the only time Rabbi Yehoshua holds that you should be passive is when what? Is when he tells you be passive, because by your passivity is not the commission of a sin. But over here, where your passivity, every moment that you're being passive, you're in violation of a rabbinic ordinance, so then maybe he would tell you that it is better to descend off the tree. So therefore, you have no raya that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua are actually the same machlokes as these 2 brises. Now, Tani chada echad ilan lach vechad ilan yavesh. The Tanya idach bemed v'mamur and balacha will be yavesh mutter. We have another bryce, two bryces that contradict each other. One bryce says that the only time there's a prohibition to climb a tree on Shabbos is if it's moist. But if it's dry, it's okay. Presumably because it's now dead, it's not a living tree anymore. So therefore, there's no concern of tolesh. Tolesh is only when you have something that's growing from the ground. This is not growing anymore, so it's okay. And the other bryce says no. Whether the tree is moist or dry, it's still going to be prohibited. So how do you reconcile the two? Amar of Yehuda lo kasha kan b'shegizo machlif kan b'shein gizo machlif. So the Gemara says, I'll tell you what the difference is. One brisa which talks about a tree that's dry is where the tree is mamish dead, and if you were to chop down a branch, it would not regenerate and grow. But the brisa which says you're not allowed to climb a dry tree is where it's dry, but not to the point where the tree is actually dead, but just that it's dried out. And therefore, if you were to cut off a branch, it would regenerate and grow, and therefore that's still a growing thing, and that's why it's going to be usher. So the Gemara says, I can't, that doesn't make sense, your answer, because gizo machlif yavish karisle. Since when do you call a dry tree something that can still regenerate and is growing? That's not a dry tree. A dry tree, by definition, is a dead tree. So elalo kasha kan biyamos achama kan biyamos ageshamim. So the Gemara answer is really the reconciliation is we're dealing with a dead tree, but in the summer that's when the Brisa says you're allowed to climb a dead tree. Why? Because it's clear that this tree is dead, because you compare it to all the other trees which are flourishing with leaves and fruit and stuff like that, and therefore you can see that this is a dead tree. In the winter, when all the other trees look dead because they have no leaves on them, so there's Maras Ayin, because people are not going to realize that the tree that you're climbing is a dead tree because it looks no different from all the other trees. I just thought about, there's a little park across the street from where I live, the Heatherton Park, and the arborists, whatever you call them, they've labeled, they put like paint on all the trees which they discovered are dead over the spring because all the other trees are growing leaves, and those are not. So that's how they know. You don't know in the winter which is living and which is dead. Okay? So the Gemara says, but even so, I still have a problem. You're telling me you're allowed to climb it in the summer, but b'yamos hachama hanatri peri. But still, you'll be snapping off different vestiges of the tree that may be like old fruit that is still clinging to the tree, even though technically there's no isser of tolesh if a tree is dead, of pulling off an old fruit or an old acorn or something like that. But nevertheless, we should be gozer that we're not going to let you pull off anything off of a tree that's dead, lest you come to do the same thing with a living tree. So we should still prohibit it even in the summer months. The Gemara answers b'deleka peri. So we have to say we're talking about a tree which has been stripped of all fruit. So the Gemara says v'hakanatri kinsi. But what about the fact that there are little twigs and branches that are still growing, and you may pull those off, and we should say that it's usher, lest you come to do the same thing with a living tree. The Gemara answers bigaduda. So you have to say we're talking about a tree that's been stripped of all branches, and all it is just one trunk that goes all the way up. So the Gemara says, Eini, is this really so? V'harav iklo la'afsatya v'asar bigaduda. That we have a halacha, that we know a story that Rav once paskined that even when there's just a tree trunk stripped of all of its branches, he went to a certain community and he said that too, even though it's dead, you're not allowed to climb it on Shabbos. You're not allowed to utilize it on Shabbos. So why did he do that according to what we're saying? The Gemara answer is Rav bika matzah v'gader bageder. The answer is that Rav, that community that Rav went to, was an unlettered, illiterate community. And Rav realized, what the Gemara says, he found an open plain. There were no rabbis there that could actually protect rabbinic law. So he had to clamp down even more than in a normal community where there were rabbanim who could safeguard the halacha. And that's why he was more machmir in that community than he would have been in a regular community.
Doesn't it help to designate a tree trunk that was already cut down?
Doesn't it?
To designate it before Shabbos. It's a tree trunk. It was they cut it down. Now it's all left as a stump. And you like to sit on it. If you designate that before Shabbos, not good enough?
It seems from the Gemara that if it's dead, it's okay. If it's not dead...
Yeah, it's dead. I mean, cut it off. So now you designate it.
It's not necessarily dead just because it's a tree trunk. If it's a stump, it could still be living.
Oh.
It could still be regenerative.
Right.
I even had a gardener when I was living in San Diego. I had a guy he looked at my avocado tree in my backyard. He says, "Oh, this is dead." He cuts it down, 6 months later, it starts growing again. So, you got to know, the tree trunk has to be mamish dead. If you can ascertain that it's mamish dead, then it's like a rock, and you're allowed to sit on it. Okay. Amar Rami bar Abba, Amar Rav Asi, Asula Adam Shiahalech al Gabi Asavim b'Shabbos. A person is not allowed to walk on grass on Shabbos. You hear this? Again, don't worry, we don't paskin this way. Mishum Shenamar, as it says, Ve'otz biraglayim chote, that he who tramples with his legs is a sinner. And so the Gemara wants to suggest that that's a reference to a person who walks on grass. Tani chada mutu leilech al gabi asavim b'Shabbos, but tani idach asur. So one brisa says that you're allowed to walk on grass, and the other brisa says you're not allowed to. So how do you reconcile it? Lo kasha habalachim habiyavation. The answer is one that's talking about dry grass. The grass is dead, so if you pull it up from the ground, you're not doing an act of tolesh. The other one is talking about moist grass, so that by pulling it up from the ground, you're doing an act of tolesh, and that's why it's aser. The ibois ema. I'll give you another teretz. Haba ha bilachim below kasha kan b'yemos achama kan b'yemos agishamim. That we could be talking about, it depends on the season. When both types of grass are moist, one type of grass, it's not a problem because since it's moist, you're not going to be pulling it out of the ground. But in the summer months, our concern is that there are seeds intermingled with the grass that's growing, and you'll be detaching the seeds or the pollen or whatever's growing with the grass. You'll be detaching it from the grass, and you'll be doing a malach of tolesh. But in the winter, where you just have stubble that's not really growing so well, then you don't have to worry about detaching seeds from the grass. The ibois ema havaha biyamos achama velokasha had the sayim misani had the lo misayim misani. I'll give you another answer. We could be talking about the summer, but one is where you're wearing shoes, and by wearing shoes, you're not uprooting grass because your shoe just goes straight down on the grass and is not uprooting it. But if you're walking barefoot, then the grass will get stuck between your toes, and you'll end up pulling it out. And another answer could be, in both cases, you're wearing shoes, but one shoe has like a curvy type of spike on the bottom, which will pull up grass with it when you lift up your foot, and the other one will not. Another answer could be, says the Gemara, where both brises are talking about where you're wearing shoes with spikes, but one brise is talking about where the grass is cropped very low to the ground, so that you don't have to worry about the spikes pulling out the grass. And the other brise is where the blades are longer, and so therefore you have to worry about your shoe pulling up the grass. And then finally, the Gemara turns everything on its ear, and it says, "Beha'idna dekaimelan Reb Shimon kulu shari." But we paskin like Reb Shimon. Reb Shimon says that a davar sheino miskavein, as long as it's not your intention to uproot grass, and it's not a psik reish, it's not for sure going to happen, then it's always mutter. So granted, the Gemara could have answered to reconcile the brises. One is Reb Yehuda and one is Reb Shimon, but the Gemara wanted to work through this exercise even before we get to that. Now, v'Amar Rami bar Chama, Amar Rav Asi, Asur Adam sheyachuf isha l'dvar mitzvah. A man, related to this issue, is not allowed to coerce his wife to be intimate with him. Right, Bob? You see the connection between the two discussions? You'll see in just a second. Shenamar ve'otz biraglayim chot. It's the same pasuk from Eov. He who tramples with his legs is a sinner. Legs is a euphemism for marital intimacy, and therefore, if you trample, meaning you coerce your wife, you're a sinner. Not only that, but if you do that, if you coerce your wife, then the child who comes from that union will be a child with a defective qualities. He'll be a defective child in some way. And Amar Rav Ika Bar Chinina Maikra, what's the pasuk? It's the very same pasuk that we quoted, which is the first part of the pasuk says, Gam below das nefesh lo tov, that when it's done without knowledge, meaning without consent, then the nefesh, the soul that comes from that union, is going to be lo tov, is going to be not good. Tanu nami hachi, Gam below das nefesh lo tov, ze'akofi ishto lidvar mitzvah. The Brisa says this explicitly, that the first part of the pasuk, which we just cited, it refers to a man who coerces his wife. That will produce a child that is not a virtuous child. The second part of the pasuk is he who tramples with his legs, which is euphemistically speaking, that is referring to a person who is intimate with his wife one time after the other consecutively. So the Gemara says, "Eini v'ha'amar Rava harotza lasus kol banav zecharim yivol v'yishna." How can you say that that's considered to be a bad thing to do? There's another Gemara that says that if a person wants to have male children, he should have intimacy with his wife 2 times in a row. So it seems to be a virtuous thing, not a bad thing to do. So the Gemara says, and by the way, you know why that is? Because the Gemara says, Isha mazras tchila yoledet zachar, that if your wife achieves her sexual pleasure first, before you do, so then the child that is born from that is conceived from that union, will be a male. So when you have intimacy twice, she's already revved up from the first time. So by the second time, she will reach her satisfaction faster than the husband will. So the Gemara says, lo kasha. So how do you reconcile it? The way you say it is, kan ladas, kan shelo ladas. One is where she's happy to consent to the second time, and one is where she's had a rough day, and she doesn't want to. In other words, there are certain situations where your wife lets you into the bed just because she has rachmanis on you, and she's only willing to do it once. But now she's had a rough day. She wants to go to bed now, and you're like a bunny. You're raring to go, and that's when it's wrong. That's when it's wrong, and that's when if you do it, you're committing an avera because you give her a break already. Amar Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol isha shetovas bala lidvar mitzvah havin labanim shafilu b'dar shel Moshe lo hayu kamosa. Furthermore, the Gemara says that if a woman solicits her husband for intimacy, she will be granted as a reward children that are greater even than those that existed in the generation of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, how do you know that? iluy b'dar shel Moshe ksiv havu lachem anoshim chachamim unavonim v'yeduim l'shivteichem. We'll read in Parshas Bamidbar that when Moshe Rabbeinu agreed to the plan of Yisro to appoint lower judges to legislate rules for the Jewish people, he told each tribe to bring forth men who had Chachma, Bina, and Das, right? They were Lubavitchers, right? They had wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Those were the 3 qualities that he solicited, that he wanted them to bring forward. But then, when it actually came to actually getting those people, what does the pasuk say? I was able to take men who had chachma and men who had das, but he couldn't find men with bina, which is a certain level of discernment or understanding, a certain savvy. When it comes to Leah, it says, Vateitze Leah likraso. Remember the story that Leah sold the rights, or Leah actually she purchased the rights to have intimacy with Yaakov Avinu for a particular night by giving the dudaim, the mandrakes, to her sister Rachel. And she comes out to greet with excitement. She comes out to greet Yaakov Avinu, and she says, "Vatomer Elai Tavo Ki Sachar Secharticha." She says, "You're going to be intimate with me because I hired you for tonight." Uchesiv, and it also says, "Umibnei Yisachar Yodei Vina Leitim Ladas Mayasa Yisrael Rashayim Asayim V'Chalachem Al Piyem." The pasuk says this pasuk is in Divrei Hayamim, and it says, now who was conceived from that union that night? Yisachar. What does it say about Yisachar? That these are people that were Yodei Bina, they possessed Bina, this quality that was not present in Moshe Rabbeinu's generation. And they were able to know what the Jewish people should do. Their leaders numbered 200, and all of their brethren followed their word. So basically you see that because Rachel was so excited about being with her husband and solicited him, that's why she was zoche to have a child with that kind of quality. So the Gemara now says, Eini, is this really so? One second, this contradicts the following statement. The Gemara says that Chava, when she sinned, was cursed with 10 curses. What were the 10 curses? Tichsiv el ha'isha amar harba arbe. The first part is, Hashem says to Chava, harba arbe itzvonech beheronech be'etzev teledivonim. I shall surely increase your travail and your labor pain. So the double language of harba arbe, what is the double language for? To tell her that she was cursed with 2 types of blood. Elu shnei tipei damim, echas dam nida ve'echas dam besum, that there are going to be 2 painful bloods that you're going to constantly suffer from. One is menstrual blood, and the other one is virginal blood, when she ruptures her membrane. Itzavonech zetzar gidul banim. Itzavonech is your travail. That refers to the pain of having to raise children. Veheronech, your labor, zetzar ha'ibor. That's the pain that comes from a woman is in labor. And finally, be'etzev tel divanim, that you will have pain when you give birth. That's the pain of childbirth. There's the pain of labor, and then it's the pain of actual childbirth. Now, kimishma'o, that's to be taken literally. And then the pasuk goes on and it says that your yearning shall be for your husband. So what does that mean? This teaches me that a woman has to suffer through yearning for her husband when he goes on a business trip, when he goes out to travel, and she's left with this great yearning that she cannot fulfill. And v'hu yimshol bach, and he shall rule over you. Melamed shehaisha tova'as b'lei ve'ish tovea b'peh v'zohi mida tova b'nashim. This teaches me, and when it says the pasuk says that he will rule over you, is a reference to the fact that women, in their modesty and in their sense of humility, do not solicit their husbands verbally. They only harbor this amor, this desire in their hearts, which they don't verbalize. Whereas a man has no compunction verbalizing his desire for his wife, and is perfectly acceptable. And this is considered to be virtuous among women, to not verbally solicit their husbands for intimacy. So how can you tell me that it's virtuous to solicit your husband when we see from here that just the opposite is true? The Gemara says, Ki kamrinan demiratzia artsuye kamei. The answer is, says the Gemara, what is considered virtuous? To solicit your husband, but not to say explicitly, I want to be intimate with you, but rather to show him affection, and by showing him affection, you demonstrate that you'd like to be intimate with him. Right?
So the kasha on Leah then? Leah kind of...
Oh, it's a good kasha. So how do you reconcile Leah? It's a very good kasha. I've seen this kasha brought down, but I don't remember what the answer is.
Speak for the Torah.
Well, that would be that. If you get really stuck, that would be the answer. But you would assume that if this is not an issue of Torah, this is an issue of derech eretz, right? So we would assume that Leah would have the proper derech eretz anyway, to be virtuous and to be modest and things like that. I know that Chazal are somewhat critical of her because she was a yatzanis. She used to go out. Mm-hmm. And so there is one school that says that Dinah learned from Leah to be a yatzanis, to go out and to be a gababout, and that's ultimately why Dinah had this downfall. But perhaps that would be the answer to your question, Shlomi. I'm not sure. So now the Gemara says, Hani Sheva Havyan. So now the Gemara says, but wait a minute. You started off by telling me that there were 10 curses. You've only listed 7. What are the other 3? Ki asa Rabdimi Amar Atufa Ka'avel Umenuda Mikol Adam V'chavusha Beveso Asurim. So the Gemara answers the other 3 are as follows. They're not from the pasuk, but they are a sort of a byproduct of the status of women today. She's got to always wrap herself like a mourner, which means she always got to have her head covered. Number 2, she's menuda mikol adam, she's exiled from all other people, and we'll explain what that means in a moment. And number 3, she's sort of like a prisoner at home because she doesn't have the ability to go out into the marketplace and into the world as much as her husband does. So now the Gemara says, "My menuda mikol adam." What does it mean that she's exiled from all other people? If you're just telling me that she can't seclude herself with a man, a person of the opposite sex, well, a man has the same prohibition as a woman of yichud, so that can't be. So ela da asira lebeitre, but rather it means she can't have 2 husbands, but a man can have 2 wives. So that's why she's sort of like at another disadvantage. Now, b'masnisa tana, the Brisa says that the other 3 are different. Number 1, megadela seir kalilis, that your hair grows wildly like the demon Lilith. Number 2, b'yoshevesu mashtenes maim kibehema, that she has to sit and urinate like an animal. And number 3, v'nases kar labaila, she becomes a pillow for her husband, because normally the normal position of intimacy is the man on top, the woman on the bottom, so she's getting squashed by her husband. So the Gemara says, V'idach, the other Mando Amar who says the other 3 are the last of the 10 curses, is because the Hani Sheva Hula, that those are not disadvantageous things, the three things that you listed. Those 3 things are actually advantages that she has. What is the pasuk in Eov mean when it says that you educate man from the animals of the land, and from the birds of the heaven you make man wise? What does that pasuk mean? That when you educate man from the beasts of the wild, this refers to a donkey. A donkey squats, a female donkey squats, and then it urinates. And that's considered to be a virtuous act of derech eretz, of humility for a woman to squat and urinate. That's not a bad thing, that's actually a good thing. And the fact that, how does man learn from the birds of the sky? Because it refers to a rooster. A rooster first appeases its mate before he's intimate with her. He brings her flowers, some chocolates. In other words, you learn from a rooster how to court your mate before intimacy. So we'll see in just a minute what he does. And by the way, the other two, although the Gemara doesn't say it explicitly, I suppose that there's nothing wrong with a woman growing hair wildly. Many men find that attractive. And the other thing that she acts as a pillow for her husband, Rashi explains that that's an advantage for a woman. The man's got to do all the work, and she gets to relax, right? So therefore, it's not. That's not a disadvantage. That's an advantage. Amar Rabbi Yechanan, ilmali lo nitna Torah, hainu lamedim snius mechatul v'gozel minamala v'arayos miyona v'derech eretz mitarnagol. Even if the Torah had never been given, we would still be able to learn basic, proper conduct from the animals of the wild. We would have learned proper modesty from the cat, who will not defecate unless it has kitty litter that it can defecate privately. We learn rules of thievery from the ant. Ants never steal from one another. And we would have learned the laws of chastity from the dove, who is monogamous and stays faithful to its mate. And we would learn derech eretz from the rooster, how to properly court your mate before intimacy. We would learn that from a rooster. Shemafayis v'achar kach boil. So my mafayis lo. So what does the rooster taka do? I joked and said it brings flowers and chocolates, but that's not what a rooster does. What does a rooster actually do? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Hachi ka Amar La. Zavino lech zige demati lach ad karech. Now, what Rashi describes that the behavior of a rooster when he wants to show that his desire for his mate is he starts lifting up his wings and sort of spreads his wings out really, really broadly and touches the ground with his wings.
Like the NBC peacock.
Maybe, yeah. And he basically says to his mate, I'm going to buy you a coat that's this big. It'll dip all the way down to the ground. In other words, he says, I'm going to buy you the world, my darling, my sweetheart. You mean everything to me. I'm going to buy you the world, right? That's what he tells her, right? And labasar hachi amar la, but after intimacy, he tells her, lishamte se lekarbalte deahu tarnagola iisle velo zavinane lech. He starts to shake his head to sort of wag his comb, the red comb that's on top of his head, and he basically is telling her as a lament, "Oy, I wish I could buy you a coat, but I have no money, and I swear that if I had the money to buy it for you and I didn't, then I would wish I could lose my comb." So basically, he's saying, "Sweetheart, I know I promised you the world, but what can I do? I'm broke." So he really knows how to sweet talk his girlfriend, you know.
This is a model for us.
But the point is that you got to know how to sweet talk the ladies, you know. Have a wonderful day.